discussion on what is epidemiology, and this is presented by the Rona Rangers. That includes EJ, Marcus, Sarah, Mark, AJ, Monisha, and Farron. And just a disclaimer that this is pre-recorded, so there may be a little bit of technical difficulties.
The learning targets for today's presentation will be understand and explain what epidemiology is, know what the epidemiologic triangle is, understand the two categories of epi-studies, identify the uses of epidemiology, and understand the relationship between epidemiology and COVID-19.
So what is epidemiology? Let's talk about that. Epidemiology is the study of distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations, and the application of this study to the prevention and control of health problems. If we're going to break it down, the distribution refers to the population in specific groups that are being affected by a disease. The determinants refers to the factors that influence population health. Epidemiology is studying these factors and figuring out why these diseases are spreading and what we can do to either stop or control these health problems.
So just a little background on the history of epidemiology. To start off, epidemiology roots are nearly 2,500 years old. In 460 BCE to 370 BCE, Hippocrates was really the first to question reasons for disease outbreaks. He was the first to suggest that diseases could be associated with environmental factors. And then moving on to 1662, John Grant was an important person to look at. He was the first person to really link epidemiology and mortality data. He was the first to quantify patterns of birth, death, and disease occurrence. This was the foundation of using data to determine patterns among diseases and how they would affect certain groups. And then moving on to the 19th century, in 1800, William Farr was considered to be the father of modern statistics and surveillance. So he concentrated his efforts on collecting vital statistics, evaluating data, and then eventually reporting it to health authorities and the general public. And then moving on to the 1850s, John Snow is said to be the father of field epidemiology. So Snow conducted studies of cholera outbreaks to discover the cause of disease and then how to prevent it. Snow worked around the clock to track down information in hospital and public records on when the outbreak began and whether the victims drank water from a certain pump. So he made a hypothesis that the water was infected. So his suspicions were right, and this prevented the disease from continuing. And then moving on to the 1930s to 40s, epidemiologists extended their methods to non-infectious diseases. This was a time when there was a huge development in research methods and theoretical parts of epidemiology. And then going on to the 1960s and 70s, healthcare workers applied epidemiology methods to eradicate naturally occurring smallpox worldwide. So this was a huge achievement in applied epidemiology. After the 70s, technology was advancing greatly, and then this helped immensely with predictions for diseases. So looking at molecular and genetic epidemiology, it furthered their research, and epidemiology eventually grew at an exponential rate. And then here we're going to go over the epidemiologic triangle, and this is really important for our discussion.
Epidemiology is the study of the emergence, distribution, and control of disease, disability, and death among groups of people. It's a field that combines elements of biology, clinical medicine, sociology, mathematics, and ecology to identify and understand health patterns and improve human health across the globe. Epidemiologists are doctors and scientists who work to understand the source of disease and other negative health effects. They estimate how many people are exposed and how the disease spreads. Epidemiologists are generally associated with infectious diseases and outbreaks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also study non-infectious health problems, like the prevalence of lung cancer from smoking or a community's increase in homicide rates. The epidemiologic triangle is a tool epidemiologists use for explaining the connection between the cause of a disease and the conditions that allow it to spread. The triangle's three corners represent the who, what, and where of a disease. Who is the host or person or people who has the disease? What is the agent or cause of the disease? And where or in what environment does the disease occur? The goal of an epidemiologist is to figure out how to sever at least one link between the corners of that triangle. Breaking the connection between the host, agent, and environment stops the disease in its tracks. In early March 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, epidemiologists from Imperial College London released a model showing the potential impacts of the disease if certain prevention methods were implemented or not. The scientists recommended large-scale social distancing to slow the spread of the virus and prevent millions of people from dying, thus severing the connection between the where and the who. The team's recommendations became public policy in many parts of the world and will result in fewer cases of the disease than expected had the triangle remained intact.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the uses of epidemiology. So I'm just going to go ahead and list off a couple of important factors. The first one is going to be investigation of epidemic. Then we have surveillance of diseases. Then we have making projections, studying the natural history and prognosis of a disease. And last but not least, to identify subgroups in the population who are high risk for disease.
All right, and then for this slide here, it's a diagram explaining the various types of epidemiological studies outlined either under observational or experimental types. And in an experimental study, an investigator determines through a controlled exposure process for each individual or community, and then tracks the individuals or communities over time to detect the effects of the exposure. In an observational study, the epidemiologist would instead be observing the exposure and disease condition of each study participant or population group. Epidemiological studies can be descriptive and or analytical. Descriptive studies are used to describe exposure and disease in a population and can be used to generate hypotheses, but they are not designed to test hypotheses. Analytical studies are intended to evaluate the association between an exposure and a disease or other health outcomes, and therefore are intended to test hypotheses. Epidemiological studies can also be prospective or retrospective. Basically, a prospective study would be one where the study starts before the exposure and outcome are established. And a retrospective study is one where the study starts after the exposure, and in most cases, the outcome's been determined. To finish up, the two most common types of observational studies are cohort studies and case control studies. And there is a third type as well mentioned, cross-sectional studies. Cohort study is going to be where the epidemiologist records whether each study participant is exposed or not, and then tracks the participants to see if they developed a disease of interest. This does differ from an experimental study because in a cohort study, the investigator observes rather than determines the participant's exposure condition. After a period of time, the investigator makes comparisons regarding the disease rate to help decipher if exposure is said to be associated with illness. A case control study is where investigators enroll a group of people with the disease and another without. Then they compare previous exposures between the two groups to help estimate the expected amount of exposure in that population. If the amount of exposure among the cases significantly higher than the expected amount, then the illness is said to be associated with that exposure. A cross-sectional study, lastly, is a sample of individuals from a population that is enrolled, and their exposures and health outcomes are measured simultaneously. The cross-sectional study then tends to assess the presence of the health outcome at that point in time without regard to duration.
Here we have two examples of analytic epidemiology. For experimental epidemiology, an investigator will randomly assign the new vaccine to participants while others will get the placebo shot. They then track the participants and look at who gets the disease. The investigator then compares the two groups and sees if the vaccine actually prevented them from getting the disease or if it did the opposite. Observational studies focus on looking at the statistics and data to gain a better understanding of diseases. In the example to the left, observational study can be used in that. Observational would be considered watching and observing the results of that experiment to gain an answer for their initial question.
Descriptive epidemiology. What is descriptive epidemiology? That is classifying the disease according to the variables, person, place, or time. Descriptive epidemiology is usually looking for trends and patterns. An example, there is an investigation of a group of workers in a factory setting who have seemingly acquired lupus through their environment. An epidemiologist would then investigate all the characteristics of the workers to see if there's any patterns. An epidemiologist would ask descriptive questions such as, do all workers show the same symptoms? Are people living close to the factory also affected? And then looking for patterns helps the epidemiologist determine the hypothesis of causation and potentially help the stopping of the virus.
So now I'm going to go over the relationship between epidemiology and COVID-19. So epidemiologists created models showing that masks and keeping distance can prevent the spread of the virus. Like that video we showed before, if we started out with this virus doing those things strictly, COVID-19 would be far less worse than it is right now. And the next point is that the more studies that were done, the more they were able to figure out which groups were more susceptible to the virus. So by observing the virus over time, they were able to collect data that this virus affects certain age groups. In this case, it was older people. And the next point I'll go over is that this virus has expanded epidemiology across the globe. So epidemiologists are collaborating across borders and time zones. They're sharing their data using online platforms. This helps for journals publishing at a faster rate, which means gaining data faster from different areas in the world. And then the last point is that epidemiology is just one of the steps to helping figure out the statistics of COVID-19. While epidemiology is super helpful, oftentimes it cannot gain the answers until they observe how the pandemic affects certain groups of people and how it is shown over time. So then they can make their recommendations and then their solutions.
Epidemiology is required to gain a better understanding of a disease and how to prevent it. While communication may be difficult with fast-paced viruses, it is crucial that we get data from all over the globe. Both descriptive and analytical studies help for prevention of disease. Understanding the who, what, and where of the epidemiologic triangle can prevent diseases quicker.
All right, and then we have a epidemiology wrap, by EJ, and we hope you enjoy.
Shout out the Rona Rangers, Aerotech for the job, and the DOH for the employment. Yeah. Yeah. Nowadays it feels like the whole world's sick. Coronavirus been killing families, what a whirlwind. It's such a mix of agony and mystery, cause first we didn't know what was happening, couldn't fix a thing. It went from an epidemic to pandemic. Difference is the scale and how long it lasts when we last get it. Epidemics are temporary and localized. The latter lasts several months and spread worldwide. So what do you do when you don't know what you got? Feeling like it's harder to breathe, chest hurting from the cough. Mask up, stay indoors, don't interact with anybody out of the family. Gotta live like that. At least that's what the leader said. Epidemiologists working full time to lead ahead. They study multiple things to figure out what it is we're dealing with and how we're gonna weed it out. There's multiple ways that they go about the task. One of the main being calling people with schemes to ask how they're feeling and who they were around when they came up with the sickness and how it all went down. Did they cough? Did y'all touch? Did y'all share a drink? Did y'all kiss? Maybe dance? Please, you gotta think. Need a break, need the facts, something's gotta give. Cause we got a chance for the taking to let the people live. Identify the distribution of the virus and then its determinants. Study this, that's the job of an epidemiologist. But it's much deeper than that. I've gotta keep it a sec. They gotta make projections of how things going and where they think is next. They also figure out of the population the highest risk. Trace the symptoms and follow the sick. Monitor where people get it and then draw up a plan. How to beat the virus and proceed to do what we can. Analyze and then describe what we're facing again. It ain't the first and not the last, but we'll certainly beat it. Coronavirus doesn't stand a chance, we're bound to defeat it.
All right, and that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And just to note, these are our references, but thank you, everybody.